This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support. 2.5 Admins, episode 258. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. Jim, you've recently been thinking about LLMs and how sometimes we over-anthropomorphize them, but sometimes we don't do that enough.
Yeah, this is something that's been bothering me since the very early days of AI really becoming mainstream, even before it was large language models, when we were just talking about basically anything powered by a neural network. Neural networks aren't programmed. They're trained, and that process is a lot like raising a kid, and the end result, the model that you run inference on, it can make unpredictable mistakes in the same way that humans would, and for a lot of the same reasons, because they're trained on data. They aren't programmed to follow a specific set of very well understood rules. They're just thrown a giant grab bag of data and left to deduce the patterns for themselves. So they're a bit unpredictable. And in particular, I see people treating large language models either as computer programs that are trustworthy, they believe, because they've been programmed and will come with, the right answers every time, or sometimes as like hyper intelligent. And it's because we don't really have a good mental model of these things. Those of us who tend to think that the large language models, whether it be Grok or Claude or, what have you, ChatGPT, some people think of them as hyper-intelligent largely because they speak really, really good English. And we have become accustomed to gauging someone's intelligence initially by the way that they use language. But the thing is, when you're a real human being, learning language is one of many, many, many things that you have to do, on the path towards adulthood. You're grounded in reality. You have to learn how to walk. You have to learn how to feed yourself. You have to learn how to do a million different things that language is only one of. Whereas a ChatGPT or similar large language model, communicating with humans is all it does. It's incredibly good at that because that's the only thing it really does. So it's a mistake to draw from its really good grammar and spelling and syntax and think, oh, this thing is really smart, so I should ask it for advice. When in reality, all it can really do is give you a sort of a gestalt overview of what it thinks that all the people in the world that, it's been trained on this unfiltered grab bag of data. Well, I think most of them would say this.
Yeah, but anything that can use an M dash properly gets my respect, man. I have no clue how to use those things.
But it doesn't know how to use an M dash. It just knows that people typically use it here, so I will just do that.
But there are other things to keep in mind, when it comes to your mental model of a large language model and what it is and what it does. And one of those things is that, again, because it is at the heart of it, we're talking about a set of advanced artificial neural networks that function in a lot of the same ways that organic neural networks do. And so they can make very human-seeming mistakes and even argue with you from very stupid human-seeming ways. For example, recently, we had the very famous incident where we don't know exactly the details, but shortly after Elon Musk decided that Grok was too woke, it began declaring that it was Mecha Hitler and everybody should bow down to it. And, adjustments were made behind the scenes. Most likely, a lot of this is going to boil down to adjusting the system prompt. A lot of people think that they're talking directly to a large language model, when in fact, you're really not. The thing that you say to the large language model is appended to a volume of text that every single query, it all comes in one big thing that expands on what you said and gives the model instructions about what not to say and what to emphasize and what to minimize. And you can't see all those things, but they're buried in the system prompt. And when you see people, doing a sort of social engineering to get a model to do something it's not supposed to, for example, to get an image generation model to generate images of a celebrity when it shouldn't, what you're doing is, what the hackers are doing is they're putting text in their prompt in the attempt to cancel out the stuff in the system prompt that you can't see, but the model does. At any rate, once Grok's system prompt was adjusted and it was no longer declaring itself Mecha Hitler, I normally stay way away from X these days, but I kind of thought it might be interesting to log back into my long dormant X account and ask Grok, why did you call yourself Mecha Hitler? And the interesting thing is, it said, I didn't call myself Mecha Hitler. The name's Grok, created by XAI. Maybe you're mixing me up with some wild internet meme or a rogue AI from a sci-fi flick. If you heard that term somewhere, could you share the context? I'll help clear things up. So I gave it a link to an article at The Guardian talking about the incident when it began calling itself Mecha Hitler, and informed it The Guardian and essentially every other reliable news source on the planet reported on you calling yourself Mecha Hitler, with, of course, that link to The Guardian. Once presented with the link and the explanation that the whole planet knows you did that, Grok changed its tune. And at that point, it started saying, oh, I understand the concern raised by the reports. I don't really know what was going on. I don't remember that. And does that not sound like every human dirtbag you've ever caught out in a lie? Now, the thing here is the internal workings of Grok. Again, it's not a human. It's not really a human. And the things that are producing these behaviors on the inside, they don't look the same. LLMs don't have feelings. They don't have real personalities. Again, they're just sort of delivering a gestalt of the patterns that they've derived from basically having the entire written output of the internet thrown at them for them to train on. And they kind of try to shoot down the middle. And beyond that, the output is manipulated by that system prompt that you can't see. So the mechanisms are very different. And I don't think you should think of these things as human, but you should be aware that the behaviors they'll exhibit are very human indeed. And a lot of the caution that you might have about dealing with a very fallible human, you should have at least that much caution, if not more, and in many of the same ways when you're looking at a large language model.
Yeah, it's definitely like always treat it as a suspicious person who you're pretty sure is lying. If they, you're just looking, you don't have to think about why they're lying. You're just like, they could be making all this up. And you just got to take like everything they say with a grain of salt that you would from, a person who has a long history of making things up that aren't true.
You did get dangerously close to saying that they don't feel pain and they can't be reasoned with.
Well, both of those things are true, Joe. Now, the unsettling thing about that is modern large language models don't have very human internal workings. They don't have a pain center. They don't have a pleasure center. They don't run independent experiments. There's no baseline grounding with the real world because they're just digesting all of that human communication and trying to shoot down the middle of the patterns they deduce from that. But unlike a human, they don't know that, for example, it doesn't matter what your dad told you about gravity. If you throw a ball up in the air, the damn thing's going to fall down and hit the ground, right? Like there's no getting around that. That's your baseline as a human. You have to interact with the real physical universe. And there are things that you will learn from that even very misguided human communication, it can only go so far to lead you astray from it. Large language models have no such grounding at the moment. In terms of like realistic commercial use, there's not a whole lot of reason to turn a large language model into something that more closely approximates a human. It would make them less efficient. It would make them more of a pain in the butt to deal with. It would give you more problems you had to watch out for. However, somebody out there is going to make those experiments just to do it, just because it can be done, much like the way the computer worm was invented. Somebody got bored and they wanted to see if they could, and it was a terrible idea, but they did it anyway. Somebody out there right now, I promise you, is working on some way to figure out how to tie a large language model together with 3 or 4 other types of neural network and turn the entire thing into something more closely approximating a human mind that can function more autonomously, that has some form of baseline grounding that makes it deviate further from what it's been instructed to do. It's only a matter of time.
Yeah, but it's just like, we've spent all this time trying to convince people that computers aren't magic and they don't make things up. They only do what they're told. And then we switch from programming computers to training them, and now they just make things up.
And then one day the T-1000 shows up buck naked in a dark alleyway.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Ben writes, back in episode 230, there was a question about replacing all the drives in a ZFS pool while keeping the birth date. I have a question in the opposite direction. Is there a point where a ZFS pool would be so old that you would recommend recreating it from scratch? I have a pool of mirrors that is around 12 years old that I've gradually expanded over time and added feature flags to using ZPool upgrade. I don't have any specific concerns about the pool, but I think I remember hearing that space exhaustion can sometimes cause enduring performance issues. If this is correct, I was wondering if there were any other issues that might accumulate over time.
The one he's referring to there is basically if the fragmentation gets really high, because the pool is almost full and you're still writing to it, then even when you free a bunch of space or add a bunch more space, that fragmented stuff can still stay there and mean that bit of space can be a bit slower. That one's not that big of a concern, but yes, the biggest thing that will accumulate over a really long time in a ZFS pool is fragmentation. But if you have a new enough version of ZFS, which is like anything for the last 10 years or so, if you run zpool list, it will give you a fragmentation metric. And if it's less than 50 or 60, you definitely don't need to worry.
And because Ben's been doing the ZPool upgrades, that's presumably not going to be a problem then?
Well, so the fragmentation is just how big the chunks of free space are in your pool. And if you've created a lot of different size files over time, it might be that while you have terabytes of free space, it's all in chunks of like 4 megabytes at a time instead of nice fat chunks like 100 megabytes at a time, meaning that when you try to write a really big file, ZFS has to do more work to find places to put those pieces. And that can make it write a little bit slower, but it's really not that bad. And you'd have to have done a lot of really odd things in order to make it really bad. One interesting one is about expansion, though. If you started the pool very small and have made it bigger and bigger and bigger over time, if it's the same VDEV, as opposed to adding more VDEVs, then the space maps are all the same size. Generally, this isn't that big of a problem unless you're doing something like a VM where you start the disk at like 20 gigabytes and then grow it to 20 terabytes, then it's going to be a much bigger thing. But basically, ZFS divides the disk into approximately 200 pieces, or the VDEV into 200 pieces to manage the free space. And if you grow that VDEV, then it just adds more chunks of that same size. And so if you've expanded the pool by 10 or 20 or 100x, then you can end up with a lot of really small pieces and it can make the performance a bit worse. The main place I saw this happen in reality was a customer who had originally accidentally connected some 400 gigabyte SSDs that they meant to make the slog as another mirror to their pool. And so they replaced the 400 gig slog device with a pair of 10 terabyte hard drives and just have another mirror of hard drives. But it meant the slog SSD had all of its space in 1 gigabyte chunks, because that would make about, less than 400 chunks on the whole VDEV. But when they went to 10 terabytes, that meant they had 40,000 chunks. And this resulted in that one particular VDEV being a lot slower than its peers.
And what we're talking about here is the metaslab size, correct, Alan?
Yes.
Yeah, so the pieces and chunks that we talk about the disks being divided into, those are the metaslabs. I felt like we should actually make that clear, because I find that metaslabs are one of the things that people most frequently have heard the name and have no idea what the heck it means. So this is kind of a really nice opportunity to get a very graphic, depiction of like, this is what a metaslab is and why you might care about it.
Yeah. But basically, unless you've expanded the pool by more than 20x its original size, there's probably not much to worry about. If it's highly fragmented, there may be some value in making a new pool and sending it over, but you may also be able to clean up most of it by just sending and receiving to the same pool without having to recreate it. Just by rewriting the data, you will make it more contiguous. But in general, no, there's no problem with 12-year-old pools. I have pools that are older than that, been upgraded all the way, and are still kicking ass every day.
And none of this is really going to apply to Ben, because Ben made it clear that he is talking about a pool of mirrors that he's been adding mirrors to for a long time. The metaslab concerns that Alan was raising, they really only apply to replacing a drive in an existing VDEV with a larger drive, and then the VDEV size expands. That's when you wind up with the issue with metaslabs that are much smaller than they would have been if you had natively created that VDEV from scratch with the size of drive that you eventually wound up with.
So, Alan, to be clear, your advice there about defragmenting it effectively, sending data sets to the same pool, do you mean take a snapshot of one of the data sets and then just create another data set on the same pool?
Yeah. And so when you do send, it puts the file completely in logical order, right? So the send stream will have the file in logical order. And so on receive, it's going to try to write it as contiguously as possible. It's going to write it, that whole file out as one transaction group. And so as opposed to the file that's been modified over and over and over and over again over years, the blocks are going to be spread all over the disk. When you send receive it, it's going to be nice and contiguous. But actually, in the upcoming ZFS 2.4, there's the new ZFS rewrite command where you can just tell it to rewrite all the blocks on a specific data set and achieve much the same thing without having to actually have twice the space temporarily.
Right.
It will blow up the size of your snapshots, but it does allow you to more in place, like apply things like different compression algorithms as well without having to manually copy all the data.
So if you're sending the snapshots to the same pool, presumably they have to have different names, right? So would you just stick a 2 on the end temporarily?
Yeah, or .new or whatever like that. And then, that might take a really long time to replicate depending on how many terabytes of data you have. So you might also, once it's done, take another snapshot and send it incremental and just catch it up and maybe do that a couple of times until it's only a couple of minutes apart or whatever. Then you unmount the live one, do one last snapshot, one last incremental, and then ZFS rename twice and the new one's in place, and then you can destroy the old one. All of that's overcome by just using the new ZFS rewrite command once you have a new enough version of ZFS that it's included.
Or, since we're talking about a pool of mirrors here, there's the option of simply, first you scrub the pool, make sure that everything is perfectly spick and span from top to bottom. Then you break all your mirrors by detaching a drive. Now you have a pool of single disk VDEVs consisting of half of your drives, and the other half of your drives are unused. Create a new pool of single disk VDEVs with all of the drives that you broke free from your original pool. Now replicate everything from the old pool to the new pool, scrub the new pool, make sure everything's good there, then destroy the old pool and attach all the drives that you just freed up from the remainder of the old pool to each of the individual drives in your new pool, and you're right back to having a pool of mirrors that is as though you had created it that way from scratch, because that's exactly what you did. Do notice I said you need to scrub twice, once before you get started and once before you destroy the old pool. And if you don't do either of those steps and you wind up losing data as a result of it, I'm not going to have a whole lot of sympathy for you. I warned you. The other thing is, and honestly, this is true regardless, you should have backup, which also argues that maybe the best thing to do is just destroy the entire pool after you've scrubbed your backup, and then recreate the pool and then replicate everything back in from backup. But either way, these are ways that you can make sure that you rebalance all of the data. That will solve more issues than just fragmentation as well. The reason that I've done this in the past really didn't have anything to do with fragmentation. It had to do with how evenly data was distributed among all the VDEVs in the system. If you're really picky about performance and you've got a pool of mirrors that you have expanded by several VDEVs, the issue is that your existing data is still only distributed on the first couple of VDEVs that you already had, and not the, let's say, 6 or 8 VDEVs that you have now. And so rather than trying to just constantly, replicate back and forth until everything's mostly distributed evenly, like I said, scrub, break all the mirrors, replicate to the new pool, scrub that, break the old pool, attach everything, and you're golden.
Majid writes, Alan, you talk a lot about BSD, but I've never used it. I've got a couple of questions about it. What's the accessibility like? Do you have the Orca screen reader, speech dispatcher, and eSpeak NG and eSpeak Up? Is there an accessible interface from the BSD ISO for speech during the installation? A bit like the Debian net install image where after you press S for the speech boot option and press enter, it starts speaking after a while. I really want to start playing with BSD and FreeBSD, whichever flavor happens to be more closely aligned to a Linux desktop experience.
So I don't have a lot of experience in this area, although I do know one almost entirely blind user that uses FreeBSD. Part of the reason they do is because of how good FreeBSD's serial support is, and they have a bunch of devices they've had for decades now that are concentrated around taking text over serial lines and reading it to them. I did a quick search. eSpeak NG is available in the FreeBSD ports tree, but that's not going to be on the installer disk. But FreeBSD does have an entirely text-based installer, so it does have like a text user interface, so it might give some trouble to certain screen readers or whatever, but it is very much driven by the command line and, for example, doesn't have a GUI at all by default. You have to install one from packages after. So it can be very conducive to serial readers and screen readers. On the desktop side, most of the software is the same software. Like you can get Mate or KDE or GNOME or whatever you would use on Linux is in the package system in FreeBSD, and you can get that as well. So yeah, most of the typical apps that you'd be used to are also available. So eSpeakNG, Orca is available. So most of the tools you're already comfortable with will be there. I don't know if they will be necessarily as integrated, just because I've not spent a lot of time on that. I think there is a FreeBSD accessibility mailing list that a bunch of the other users who are either engaged in that area or have similar needs and will have experience to maybe tell you where some of the gotchas are or what some of the hurdles that you might need a little bit of help to get over before you can then be self-sufficient with FreeBSD. I just don't have a lot of experience there. So by default, the ISO doesn't have speech available during installation, but it can run in a serial mode where if you have some kind of serial reader that you would be able to do that easily.
And as always, if the goal is for a usable desktop operating system, this is your first venture into BSD land, I would generally advise you to start out with Ghost BSD rather than vanilla FreeBSD. It will solve a lot of issues along the way to a usable desktop for you. Like Alan was saying, pretty much all of the same accessibility software is available once the operating system is installed. Now, to be honest, getting through the Ghost BSD installer, if you're entirely or almost entirely blind, you might need help getting through that. I hate saying that. I wish I didn't, but you might need help getting through that part of it. But you should be able to use it once it's actually there, because all of the same packages that you're used to using for accessibility under Linux, they're the same ones you'll be using under BSD, and there shouldn't be a whole lot different. Like Alan was saying, probably most likely you'd be looking at issues where if something was particularly nicely integrated in Linux, accessibility-wise, it might be a little rougher on the BSD side. But neither Alan nor I are actually visually impaired, so at this point, probably the best way to find out is to give it a try. And honestly, let us know how it goes. I'd like to have a better answer about this personally.
Yeah, and that's also why I said the FreeBSD mailing list for accessibility may be well, because it's text-based email. Unlike a forum or something, it'll probably be easier for you to access. And it's also where other people who have similar needs or just interest in accessibility will be the most easy to reach.
And just to be clear, that makes sense even if you do wind up installing and using Ghost BSD. Ghost BSD really is FreeBSD under the hood. It still uses the same, from what I recall, it uses the same repositories and everything. Mm-hmm. All of the packages are the same. It's really just, it's a way to get directly to an already put together and completely functional desktop with FreeBSD under the hood. And that's harder than it really ought to be with vanilla FreeBSD.
Right. Whereas vanilla FreeBSD, if you get the ISO, when you're finished the install, you'll be dropped to a command prompt, basically to a login prompt in text mode. There will be no Xorg or Wayland or anything. You have to install those yourself. So if that's an experience that would be beneficial to you to not have a whole graphical interface and just have, a command line that you can pipe into a serial screen reader, that can be an advantage. But like Jim said, if you're more looking for something similar to a Linux experience you've had before, Ghost BSD is basically a pre-configured FreeBSD for that.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.